In my first discussion about the sound, I asked George Lucas, me being the scientist, the representative of science, there's no sound in space, George, so we're just not going to hear anything when we're out there flying around. And he was very puzzled by that. He said, of course not. We're going to hear everything. We're going to hear music.
Welcome to Locarno Meets, a movie podcast brought to you by UBS from the Locarno Film Festival. All right, close your eyes. Think of the sound that a lightsaber makes. Now think of the sound that Darth Vader makes when he breathes. Think of E.T. Think of E.T. wanting to go home. All of those sounds, so indelibly etched in your mind, come from the brilliant work of Ben Burtt. Ben, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
You're here at Locarno to collect the Vision Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
There's obviously a vague irony in it being called the Vision Award.
Yes, right. Well, sound, it's always follows picture.
For a lot of filmmakers in your generation, it feels like there's the origin of their passion quite often came from something like home movies with the Super 8 video or something like that. And I wondered if there was a similar origin story for you with sound.
When I was around 6 years old, I had a serious illness that put me in the hospital. And after a week or two of recovery, I was brought home weak and couldn't go back to school right away. And I was laying in bed, and my father, who was a professor at a Syracuse University nearby, was looking for something for me to do. And he brought home a tape recorder from the university for me to play with in my room and by my bedside. And at that time, a tape recorder was a big, heavy, almost it took two people to carry it, sort of. And he showed me how to use the microphone, and I could record my voice and play back sounds and slow it down, that sort of thing.
Cool.
And so that was my introduction to audio recording. And from that point on, became a hobby of mine, along with photography, along with sports and other things. It was one of the tools that I had that I could collect, sounds from the world around me. Record my friends. I would try making little dramas, space movies with just sound, but. What I used it most for was to record movies off television. And I had a whole collection of my favorite shows, westerns and horror films and science fiction. And I would listen to them back for pleasure, long before DVDs or anything of that sort. And so I developed a real interest in how movie soundtracks were made. It was a combination of I developed an interest in how movie soundtracks were made. There was dialogue, music. I'm sorry, I'm hitting this. We'll go back. We've got to have good sound. In listening to all these films with headphones, I re-experienced the movies through their sound only. And I became very well educated as to how the dialogue, the music, and the sound effects in the movie came together to support and complete the illusion of the visuals. It was just a hobby. I never considered it to be any professional interest in a career, but I didn't know it. But all that listening that I did was educating me as to the legacy of how sound was attached to the visuals of motion pictures.
Did you, at that time, if you're with the obsessive mind of a kid, right? And if you're really studying the sound, are you developing kind of critical faculties around sound? Are you saying, this one Western show always has good sound, but this one is a bit shoddy?
I developed a taste for certain things in the movies and styles. And I would seek out the shows that had, Max Steiner music or Bernard Herrmann. I would record westerns, but only Warner Brothers westerns because I love their arrows and their gunshots and horses and things of that sort. Yes, I learned that each major Hollywood studio had its own collection of sound, and they would reuse it over and over again. And I got very familiar with that and got very curious as to where these sounds came from and how did they record the wind. I knew that my little toy arrows shooting them did not sound like the Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. So I knew something was going on in the movie sound business that was a mystery to me as to how they were achieving and even selecting those particular types of sounds.
I was interested to read that there was a chance meeting with Arthur C. Clarke at your school, right at the moment when 2001: A Space Odyssey is coming out and blowing everybody's minds. What happened? You babysat him for a day.
I was a physics major at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania. And one day, Arthur C. Clarke, the author of 2001, came as a guest to the school to talk about technology of the future. It wasn't about movies or anything. But I knew that he had been connected with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I had seen the film some months prior to this and was, fascinated by the movie, couldn't stop thinking about how did they do this and how was it done and what was behind it all. And so I began asking him some questions as I babysat him. We had some downtime between his appearances, and I was his escort on campus. We were alone in a classroom, a physics classroom.
What a dream.
Yeah, and he went up to the blackboard and started answering all my questions about front projection and matte painting and the kind of work that went in to do the special effects in 2001. And so I realized at that point that here was a man who was not only a scientist and dealt with the realities of space travel and so on, but he also was a science fiction writer. And he had his imagination for things that didn't exist yet, but maybe would exist in the future. He combined the fictional with the non-fictional. And it kind of answered a question for me, because I saw myself as studying science, but to be honest, I really wanted to meet spacemen, or meet aliens. And I didn't know how to resolve that conflict between reality and fantasy. But he did it. So I was inspired to go on from there, thinking I could follow a career in one of my hobbies, which was filmmaking, with a special interest in sound, but I had just as much interest in the visuals as well. I built a lot of my own special effects equipment based on what Arthur Clarke showed me on his diagrams from 2001. I went home and built a slit scan machine so I could produce stretched out stars and visuals, and I worked it out. Since I had some scientific background, I could figure out a way to do it with my 16 millimeter camera. And so he showed me that it was possible to kind of have a foot in both worlds and not be embarrassed to to talk about aliens when there wasn't any evidence for them or something like that. I remember on my physics project at school, I very much wanted to build a radio telescope to communicate with aliens. But of course, they just looked at it and said, no, you're going to study the diffraction of X-rays in titanium instead. So I had to do that.
Well, I'm sure that interest would have, entertained George Lucas. How did you two meet?
I knew of Lucas because he was a former film student who got a chance in Hollywood as a young person to direct. He did his film THX 1138. I remember seeing a poster on the wall in the school of pictures of him, and they were showing some of his films at a nearby college. I didn't get a chance.
Is this after American Graffiti?
No,
it's
George
THX.
Lucas's first feature was called THX 1138.
It's a brilliant film, yeah.
Right. And it didn't do all that well commercially, but it was his statement, is using his great imagination. And I saw a poster that his film was being included in a showing of films at a nearby college, which I couldn't get there to see it. But I knew of him, and when I went to California eventually and to USC Film School, where he had gone, he was a hero from coming out of that school by us other students. So I knew of him, but had not met him. It wasn't until I was just graduating with my graduate degree in film production. I had a special interest in sound at that point because not many students were that interested in sound. I was like other students. I wanted to direct and write and star and be the auteur of my own films. Every student did.
Of course.
But to face it realistically and get a job and earn a living, you had to start somewhere, or auteurs don't get a job right out of school. So I had gotten work as a sound editor in some very low-budget, backwater Hollywood little companies making Roger Corman films, New World Pictures, that sort of thing, which was a source of income and good experience. And I had a reputation in the USC cinema department as being the one student who just loved sound effects and was very interested in recording, and that was true. So when George Lucas was planning his movie, which was called The Star Wars at that time, he had his producer, Gary Kurtz, call USC and say, is there a student there who's bright, who likes to record sounds, who shows some imagination? We're looking for someone to replace Walter Murch, because Walter had been George's sound man.
Sure.
Designer and editor, but he was off working with Francis Coppola at that time. Is not available. And so I was recommended by the sound department there, a professor named Ken Mura, as the student for the job. And of course they wanted somebody cheap, which the student was cheap. And secondly, George Lucas probably, no doubt, wanted someone that he could teach him the ways that he wants to make movies.
Sure.
Not someone that with a big track record in Hollywood who had their own habits already developed. Because George was an innovator when it came to the process of how you treat sound on a movie and the level of importance it gets in the overall process. So I was recommended for the job and went and interviewed first with Gary Kurtz, the producer, and then on a second meeting with George Lucas. And they showed me pictures on the wall of Ralph McQuarrie's art for Star Wars. They were still a year away from filming, and I was amazed. I thought, I actually made some of this movie in my backyard as a kid. I get it. I understand it. I felt I was right for the subject. It was really a gift handed to me. I'd grown up being fully prepared for this movie with the interest in movies that I had. I think God had a plan, and it was a gift to me that my interest in action and visual effects and sound and make-believe science fiction all came together in this first job opportunity.
And it must have been like, there must have been an incredible energy. You've got Phil Tippett, you've got you've got, all of these young innovators changing cinema, but presumably without knowing that you're changing cinema. Right. What did it feel like? And also, was it a moment in time where just kind of tech and art were coming together, or was it really the power of Lucas's vision and direction?
A number of crossroads were taking place at that time. Now, the crew for Star Wars on the U.S. side, the post-production and the visual effects, were young people, many of them coming from other industries, industrial design, or right out of design school, or camera people who had developed very special cameras for the Jet Propulsion Lab, and they were in touch with some of the earliest computer-controlled techniques of cameras, and they were gathering together people that were not Hollywood, with their roots down in Hollywood already. And so there was a spirit of underdogs, that we were experimenters. Of course, no one could see the future. We just were happy to work on this one science fiction movie that we all kind of were desperate to see. It's the kind of movie we always wanted to be a part of. No one was thinking that it would be a hit or then a blockbuster, or we'd still be talking about it 50 years later. None of that was at all possible at the time.
What was so notable about the aesthetic of Star Wars, of course, the approach to sci-fi where there's a lived-in tangible aesthetic, as opposed to a sci-fi that feels very clean and new, which had kind of been a bit of a cliche before. And I wondered if that visual aesthetic was reflected in the requests that George Lucas made to you for the sound. Did he want the sounds to feel tangible and as though they existed in the real world?
In my first discussion about the sound, I asked George Lucas, me being the scientist, representative science, there's no sound in space, George, so we're just not going to hear anything when we're out there flying around. And he was very puzzled by that. He said, "Of course not. We're going to hear everything. We're going to hear music. We're going to. This is going to be like an old Hollywood swashbuckler, Western. All of these things combined." And so I immediately got the idea that it wasn't about science.
Sure.
Okay. And I understood that. That was fine. I had to answer for that to my old physics professor, who eventually chided me when after Star Wars was a big hit, and I went back to visit my school. My physics professor came to me and said, like it was a secret. He said, "Ben, there's no sound in space." And so he was still, educating me.
Still furious every night thinking.
Yeah, and he was a specialist in acoustics too.
Oh God!
So I really probably offended him in some way, but he smiled. I think he appreciated it. But George Lucas, in our first meeting, then went on to describe what he wanted. He termed it an organic environment, organic universe. He wanted the equipment to be used looking, that it was unoiled, it was scratched up, the sounds might reflect. If it's the Millennium Falcon and it's a spaceship put together with spare parts and under repair most of the time, that it could rattle, it could squeak, it could shake, and so on. He wanted things to appear as a used universe. Where things were made noise. And he wanted the sounds to be derived from the real acoustic sounds around us, not electronic sound, not something coming from a synthesizer or a theremin or some of the other electronic sources of sound, which were kind of the norm for science fiction space movies at the time. This electronic background. He didn't want that. So I understood that. And so I said about, what should I do? And he says, well, go to factories, record motors, go to the zoo and record animals, wander out into the world and gather real things that we can then manufacture the Star Wars universe out of. And so that's what I set out to do. They gave me a very nice Swiss recorder, a Nagra, beautiful machine, reel-to-reel magnetic recorder. And I set about gathering sound. I just lived in my apartment, and I would go off every day, try to find something new. I'd go hang out at the end of the airport runway or go to the zoo or make an appointment to record some special kind of helicopter.
Sure.
That was being tested.
So did you have a kind of a board up saying, right, I need a lightsaber, I need Chewbacca, and you just go around going, oh, that could work there, that could work there.
I actually did have, I broke the script down into all the categories: creatures, aliens, weapons, environments. And I actually had a map on the wall, big map of the area of Los Angeles and a few hundred miles of the desert around it. And I would stick onto that map either where I had been to record or a place I planned to go. So I did organize it and keep track of notes, that sort of thing. They actually wanted to produce the sounds of Chewbacca first.
Okay.
That was the first request, because they wanted to develop sound they liked prior to shooting.
Oh, so that people could interact.
Yes, so that Peter Mayhew, who was going to be the Wookiee, would have some sense of how the mask was going to sync up. The movements were limited in the prosthetic mask and so on they were building. And George had suggested animal sounds, maybe a dog, maybe a bear, something of that sort. And he said maybe bears would be really good. And so I set out trying to gather the sounds of bears wherever they might be. And they're not easy to find or vocalize. They don't take direction very easily. I tried going to the zoo, but most of the bears were just happy and asleep. You see a paw sticking out of the cage with flies around it or something.
Maybe leave a sleeping bear lie.
Yeah, exactly. I love those sleeping bears lying. I eventually got in touch with a man who trained animals for the movies, that had a ranch out in the desert where he had lions and he had a bear, had several bears. But he had this one young, it was like a child. It wasn't really a cub any longer, but it was a teenager, you might say, that was still friendly and workable. You could be in a pen with it and it was not going to be dangerous. And he said, come on out and we'll try to get some sounds out of this bear. And so I went there and spent a day in a pen outside, and they knew the animal. The fellow's name was Monty Cox, and the other trainer was a woman named Susan Backlany. She was actually a stunt woman who was the woman in Jaws who goes out at the very beginning of the movie and gets pulled down through the water. But here she and I, trying to feed pieces of bread soaked in milk to the bear. He had been not fed for a day or so, and then you would tease him and then take the bread away, and the bear would go, kind of like that. I can imitate it now, but I recorded a whole session of the bear making different vocals. They knew the bear. We would bring another animal, like a cougar or leopard, out on a leash, walk it by. The bear would get agitated and make an angry sound, that sort of thing. They knew how to get certain responses out of the animal. So it was like an ADR session, looping. And so I took those recordings and broke them all up into little tiny bits, each individual sound, and organized them by the emotion that I projected into the sound's meaning. Here's happy sounds, here's angry sounds, and built a template, a collection, which I could then pull from and cut together a little bit at a time.
Because that's one of the interesting things with Chewie, even R2, later on with Wall-E and different work, is you've had to build languages without language. These characters have to have quite long and involved conversations with people, and especially in Star Wars, there aren't really subtitles anywhere.
Right.
What was your kind of approach to, language craft?
The discovery that was made about languages was that we weren't trying to put words up that you would completely understand, but you would get the context emotionally of the words. We know that there are a lot of sounds in any language. Let's just say in English, since I know that best, that you can communicate a feeling through a groan or a sigh, this sort of thing. And especially if you listen to children as they learn to talk, or even a baby that's making sounds, the parents can recognize a meaning to sounds. Hungry, uncomfortable, content, by just these non-word sounds, just these non-verbal expressions. So the idea came about after a lot of experimenting to create a languages using just the sounds that you don't understand, but you understand a meaning to it. It has enough feeling to it in the context of the story that it makes itself clear. I mean, there's two types. You have the aliens, let's say, and it's a slightly different story. Their languages would be manufactured out of exotic languages that were not English. Talk about that separately. But the robots, especially R2-D2, was made out of sounds that were, in a sense, universal to all languages. That everybody understood what a pleasant sound was of a baby making a sound. We thought at one point maybe we should just record babies, but babies are hard to record.
They're as hard as bears.
What's that?
They're as hard as bears.
Yeah. Well, babies, they don't take direction, and they don't make noise cleanly in front of the microphone without movements and all kinds of stuff. The discovery that kind of was a breakthrough was that for R2-D2, that when George and I were discussing it, and I would play him auditions of sounds I would put together. I would take a scene, I would cut some sounds into it, and then we'd look at it together and critique it. We found that we were making sounds in talking to each other. Shouldn't it be more like this? Woo, woo, yeek, woo. We were making little boy funny noises, little motor sounds, little beeps and boops and electronic sounds as the human voice imitates it. And it occurred to me, well, maybe that's just what we should do. Find a way to combine the electronic sounds with a synthesizer, which I had been using, which didn't come to life. Combine those sounds with human input, which could give it a performance, a sense of meaning, emotional meaning. And that ended up being the path to follow on that, to blend the two.
One particularly emotional character that you worked with was E.T. How did you with a character that has to, basically the whole world needs to fall in love with, and doesn't get very many lines. What was your approach to crafting his voice?
E.T., throughout the course of the film, goes from a very animalistic verbal, vocals, little growls and murmurs, and it slowly turns into speech. And then there's this small library of lines in English, or in with words at the end. So it had to make that transition. And so I had quite a good collection of animal sounds at this point from working on Star Wars, and I was always gathering new ones in between the films because they were a valuable resource for me to record any kind of sea otter or baby foxes or something. If I'd hear of something, I'd try to go and record it because I knew it would be useful later. So I was applying some of those sounds to E.T. in the more animalistic phase. And but the search for someone to do the voices, the words, was we tried a number of actual actresses who had a good vocal range. They could do unusual sounding voices, and although those were good, you still could kind of hear the human voice behind it. It's hard to disguise the human voice. We're all experts at analyzing it, being very critical. Eventually, I heard the sound of a woman in a store. I was shopping in a camera store to get some film, and she was buying something at the counter. I couldn't see who she was, but I heard this voice, a deep, low-pitched voice, saying something like, "Do you take my credit card?" Or something like that. And I said, "Oh, that's E.T. That's it." And this is just around the corner from our studio, a block away. And so I waited outside on the sidewalk afterwards for her to come out. And I asked her, "Do you want to be an alien in a movie?" And she paused for a moment and then said, "Well, maybe," that kind of thing. And I arranged for her to come to the studio maybe the next day. It was very quickly thereafter. And had her read some of the lines, and I could see whether she could be coached through a performance. And I began recording her. I had her speak in sort of a monotone. Now, the thing about her voice that was good, for me was that the gender was not clear. You want to have the illusion to your audience if it's an alien character. Well, we're not speaking male and female in the normal terms at all, and so if you can find a voice which is mysterious, that you can't say, oh, that's a child or that's an old man or something. Those are valuable voices to have when you're doing aliens, because you start with very few clues to the audience to be critical of. And so I started recording her. And the way it worked with Steven Spielberg, we had agreed for the time being that I would not tell him what I'm doing, the process. I wouldn't show him and send him a tape and say, here's a woman doing it, or here's this or that. Then I think it was actually his idea, because he wanted to have the same kind of judgment that the audience would have, just react to it without any knowledge of what's going on behind the scenes. And so I sent him samples of this woman named Pat Welsh was her name, to him, and that really began to click for him, and we stuck with it and just kept refining that as we went along through the whole movie.
I love the fact that you found E.T. in a shop. Thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on your award.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.